The smell of simmering beef and onions always clung to Alara's apron, a comforting scent that followed her through the cozy rooms of the Heron's Rest. She was a woman etched with quiet sorrow, a widow whose laughter had long ago faded like old photographs. Yet, a warmth bloomed in her eyes when she saw a traveler settle in. Hers wasn't grand, but it was clean and smelled of fresh-baked bread. Every morning, Alara rose with the sun, her hands busy kneading dough or stirring the thick stew that would feed her guests. The wooden floors creaked under her worn boots as she moved from the kitchen to the small dining room, setting out chipped ceramic cups and simple tin plates. She kept the rooms neat, each bed made with a patchwork quilt, even if the blankets were thin from many washings. She rarely spoke of her past, and no one dared ask. Her life was the in now, a quiet rhythm of cooking, cleaning, and caring. The Heron's Rest was her sanctuary, and she, in turn, offered sanctuary to others. She saw many faces come and go, some tired from the road, others carrying burdens heavier than their worn packs. Alara just offered a warm place to rest and a hearty meal, a small kindness that often meant the world. Her days were long, but they were filled with purpose, a gentle hum of life in the heart of her quiet world. Beyond the paying travelers, Alara kept a special eye out for those who looked truly lost. Sometimes it was a man with eyes that spoke of too many cold nights, too much hunger. Other times, a woman with a child clutched tight, seeking shelter from a storm brewing in their lives. And often, it was a boy, no older than 10 or 12, dusty and wide-eyed, a runaway from a harsh farm or a cruel master. Alara never asked their stories. She just saw their need. For the men, she'd point to the small, shared bunk room in the back, where beds were cheap or sometimes free if she saw they had nothing. Alara simply ushered him in, sat him by the fire, and handed him a steaming bowl of her hearty stew. "Eat," she said, her voice soft. "There's a spare cot in the bunk room." The boy ate, his eyes darting around, but he slowly relaxed. He stayed a few days, helping out, before vanishing as quietly as he arrived. Alara expected nothing in return. She just offered what she could, a warm bed, a hot meal, and a quiet moment of peace, no questions asked. It was her way of tending to the broken parts of the world, one silent act of kindness at a time. The Heron's Rest wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a living, breathing haven. The air inside always carried the comforting weight of Alara's cooking, a mix of hearty stew, fresh-baked bread, and a faint, sweet smell of apples from the pies she sometimes made. In the main dining room, the wooden tables bore the marks of countless meals, scarred by knives and spilled drinks. The cups, too, told their own stories, each one with a tiny chip on its rim or a faded pattern, showing how many hands had held them. But the real heart of the inn beat in the bunk rooms. Here, shadows danced on the walls from the flickering oil lamps. The scent of stale tobacco, damp wool, and unwashed bodies mingled with the fainter, cleaner smell of the lye soap Alara used for washing. Beds were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses, but they were always dry and warm. At night, after Alara had doused the last lamp in the kitchen, a symphony of hushed sounds would begin. Low murmurs from men sharing tales of hard travels, soft sighs from those finally finding rest, and the occasional creak of a bed as someone shifted. Sometimes a cough would echo or a snore would rumble, but mostly it was the quiet, steady rhythm of breath and whispers. These whispers weren't always happy. Sometimes they were sad, sometimes fearful, but they were always safe. In a Heron's Rest, under Alara's watchful, silent care, these forgotten souls found a moment of peace, a shared space where they could simply be without judgment or threat. It was a shelter woven from kindness and warm air. The years rolled by like the heavy wheels of a passing wagon. Alara grew a little older, her hair a bit grayer, her steps a little slower, but her hands were still quick and her heart still warm. The faces in the Heron's Rest changed constantly. Travelers came and went, some staying only a night, others for weeks, helping with chores before moving on. The inn remained a steady anchor in a shifting world. Among those who came and went were many of the runaway boys Alara had quietly taken in. They arrived as scrawny, fearful children, their clothes ragged and their bellies empty. They'd stay a few days, sometimes a few weeks, learning how to chop wood, mend fences, or carry water. Alara would feed them, make sure they had clean clothes, and offer them the simple kindness they had never known. Then, one morning, they would be gone, leaving behind only the quiet echo of their footsteps and a small, lingering sense of emptiness. Alara never expected to see them again. She knew life was hard, and most people, once they found their footing, moved on to new places, new lives. She just hoped they remembered the Heron's Rest as a place of safety. But what she didn't know was that her quiet acts of care were like seeds planted in dry ground. They took root deep in the hearts of those boys. They carried the memory of her stew, the warmth of her fire, and the gentle touch of her hand through all their hard travels. Even as they grew into men, toughened by the world, a flicker of Alara's kindness remained within them, a quiet promise of a debt one day to be repaid. The quiet hum of life in Alara's town, a place nestled by a winding river, was about to be broken. Rumors began to swirl, at first like whispers on the wind, then growing louder, like thunder before a storm. A big company, known only as the Ironclad Corporation, had set its greedy eyes on the town's land. They wanted to dig for something valuable hidden deep beneath the earth, and they didn't care who stood in their way. At first, fancy men in fine suits arrived, offering money for homes and farms. They spoke with smooth words, promising a brighter future. But soon, their smiles turned thin, and their offers turned into threats. They started buying up land piece by piece, pushing out families who had lived there for generations. If someone refused to sell, strange things would happen. Wells would run dry, fences would be torn down in the night, or tools would go missing. The townspeople, simple farmers and shopkeepers, didn't know how to fight against such a powerful force. The Ironclad Corporation had lawyers and hired toughs, men with hard eyes and heavy boots who patrolled the dusty roads. Fear began to creep into every home, making people suspicious of their neighbors and hesitant to speak out. The once friendly chatter in the town square grew quiet, replaced by worried glances and hushed conversations. Even at the Heron's Rest, the usual warmth felt a little colder as shadows of worry stretched long across the familiar rooms. Alara heard the tales, saw the fear in her guests' eyes, and a deep unease settled in her heart. This was a different kind of storm, one that threatened to swallow everything she held dear. The fear Alara felt was a heavy blanket, smothering the usual warmth of her inn. She watched the townsfolk, their faces lined with worry, their shoulders slumped. Old man Hemlock, who had tended his apple orchard for 50 years, sat at her table, his gnarled hands shaking as he spoke of the threats he'd received. Mrs. Gable, usually so cheerful, now only sighed, her small shop seeing fewer and fewer customers as people stayed home, afraid. They talked in hushed tones about what to do, but no one had an answer. The Ironclad Corporation was too big, too rich, too strong. They owned the lawmen and had men with guns. How could simple farmers and shopkeepers fight against that? They tried to hold meetings, but few dared to come, fearing they'd be marked by the company's watchful eyes. Those who did attend spoke of leaving, of finding new homes far away, abandoning everything they knew. Alara felt the same despair. Her inn, her home, her whole life was here. The thought of losing it, of seeing the town she loved crumble under the company's boots, made her heart ache. She tried to offer comfort, to serve extra portions of stew, but even her kindness felt small against such a large and scary problem. She looked at the chipped cups, the worn tables, everything that meant home, and wondered how much longer they would be hers. The helplessness was a bitter taste in her mouth. They were like ants against an elephant, and no one knew how to even begin to push back. Just when the gloom felt deepest, a new kind of ripple began to spread through the town. It started subtly, with a stranger walking into the Heron's Rest, his eyes scanning the room with an almost familiar intensity. He wasn't one of the company's men. His clothes were plain, worn, but he carried himself with a quiet strength. Alara, stirring her stew pot, felt a strange tug at her memory. He looked familiar. Then another arrived, and another. They didn't come in fancy carriages or with loud boasts. They walked or rode tired horses, their faces hardened by sun and wind, their hands calloused. They were men who had seen much of the world, men who carried themselves with the easy confidence of those who knew how to handle themselves. They weren't soldiers, but they looked like they could be. One evening, a tall man with a scar near as I stepped into the inn. Alara, wiping down the counter, paused. His eyes, though older and wiser, held a spark she recognized. Alara, he asked, his voice rough but kind, is this still the Heron's Rest? It was young Thomas, the scrawny boy who had shivered by her fire all those years ago. He was no longer scrawny. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, and there was a glint in his eye that spoke of purpose. Soon, more faces from her past appeared. Boys she had fed and sheltered, now grown into men, some with beards, some with missing teeth, but all with that same knowing look in their eyes. They hadn't forgotten. They had heard the whispers about the ironclad corporation and had come. They were a ragged bunch, not a proper army, but each one looked ready to stand his ground. A tiny flicker of hope, long dormant, ignited in Alara's chest. The Heron's Rest, once a place of quiet refuge, now buzzed with a new kind of energy. The familiar smell of stew mixed with the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco as more and more of Alara's boys arrived. They filled the bunk rooms, their whispers no longer just about travel, but about tactics and plans. Thomas, the scar-faced leader, gathered them around the main dining table, its worn surface now serving as a map of their impending battle. They were a motley crew, a former sailor, a quiet tracker, a burly blacksmith, and others whose pasts were as varied as their faces. Each had found his way back, drawn by the invisible thread of kindness Alara had woven years ago. They spoke in low, serious tones, their voices firm. They knew the company's ways, their tricks, and their weaknesses. They had faced hard things in their lives, and this was just another one. Alara moved among them, refilling chipped cups with coffee, offering plates of biscuits. She listened, wide-eyed, as they talked of flanking maneuvers and diversion tactics. It wasn't just brute force they planned, but cleverness. They knew the land, having grown up around it, and they knew the people. They spoke of cutting off supply lines, of creating confusion, of hitting the company where it hurt the most, its pockets and its pride. The inn became their headquarters, a place where maps were spread, ideas were shared, and strategies were honed. The air was thick with purpose. Alara watched them, these men who were once scared boys, now standing tall, ready to fight for her, for the town, for the memory of the safe haven she had given them. A quiet strength settled over her, a feeling she hadn't known in years. The whispers about the Heron's Rest boys spread quickly through town. At first, it was disbelief, then cautious curiosity. Old man Hemlock, who had almost given up hope, peered through his window and saw Thomas, grown and strong, talking to his neighbors. Mrs. Gable, her shoulders less slumped now, heard snippets of brave talk from her customers. The fear that had gripped the town began to loosen its hold, replaced by a fragile, but growing seed of hope. People started venturing out more. They walked past the inn, some stopping to look, others gathering the courage to step inside. They saw the men, not as strangers, but as the boys they once knew, the ones who helped with chores, who played in the fields, who had left so long ago. The sight of their own returning, ready to stand up, was like a warm fire spreading through a cold house. Soon, the townspeople weren't just watching. They were asking how they could help. Farmers offered their knowledge of the land, showing hidden paths and old shortcuts. Shopkeepers started to pool their meager resources, gathering food and supplies for the growing group of defenders. Even the children, who had been hiding inside, began to run errands, their eyes wide with excitement. The fight was no longer just for Alara or her boys. It was for everyone. The town, once divided by fear, was now uniting, a single, determined heartbeat against the powerful shadow of the ironclad corporation. Alara watched, her heart full, as her quiet acts of kindness blossomed into a powerful, shared resolve. The morning of the standoff dawned crisp and clear, but the air was thick with tension. The ironclad corporation's men, a grim line of hired guns and heavy machinery, advanced towards the town's edge. They expected easy victory, a quick sweep of frightened locals. But this time, they met something different. From the woods, from behind fences, and from the roofs of buildings, the town's defenders emerged. Thomas led the charge, his voice a clear call that echoed across the fields. His boys, now men, moved with practiced ease, using the land they knew so well to their advantage. A former sailor, now a sharp-eyed lookout, called out positions from the old water tower. The quiet tracker guided a group through a hidden gully, surprising a flank of company men. The burly blacksmith, armed with a heavy wrench, stood firm against a bulldozer, joined by other townsfolk. It wasn't a clean fight. Dust flew, shouts rang out, and the clash of metal on metal filled the air. The company men, used to easy intimidation, were confused by the organized resistance. Farmers used their pitchforks with surprising skill, while shopkeepers, armed with old hunting rifles, took careful aim. Women and children, organized by Alara, ran supplies, carried water, and tended to those who stumbled. Alara herself, apron still on, moved through the fray, a steady presence, her eyes missing nothing. The fight raged for hours. There were moments when it seemed the company's brute force would win, but then a well-placed rock, a sudden diversion, or a coordinated move from Thomas's men would turn the tide. Everyone worked together, a true force, proving that a united heart could stand against even the strongest, most ruthless enemy. As the battle raged, a moment came that seemed to decide everything. A group of the company's men, seeing their plans fall apart, made a desperate charge towards the Heron's Rest, thinking to burn it down. They knew it was the heart of the resistance. Alara, still moving among the defenders, saw them coming. Her own heart leaped in her throat, but before she could even cry out, Thomas was there. He moved like a shadow, leading a small, fierce group of men. They were the ones she had fed by her fire, the ones who had slept in her bunk rooms, the ones who owed her everything. With a roar, they met the company men head-on, protecting the inn with a ferocity born of deep loyalty. One of the men, a burly fellow named Silas who had been a quiet, hungry boy many years ago, threw himself in front of Alara as a stray bullet whizzed past. "Get inside, Alara!" he yelled, his face grim. Another, a nimble young man known as Flicker, who had once cleaned her stables, expertly disabled a company vehicle that threatened to ram the inn's porch. Each one fought with a personal stake, a fire in their eyes that spoke of old kindness repaid. It wasn't just the inn they were protecting, it was the memory of warmth, safety, and a full belly. It was the simple, unconditional care Alara had offered when no one else would. Their actions spoke louder than any words, a powerful testament to the seeds of kindness she had sown. They saved her inn, and by doing so, they saved the town, pushing back the dark tide with the strength of gratitude and a shared past. The ironclad corporation's men, defeated and confused by the town's fierce and unexpected resistance, finally turned and fled. They hadn't expected a community to fight back with such heart and cunning. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by shouts of triumph and the quiet relief of exhaustion. The town was safe. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with a different kind of energy. The damage was assessed, the injured were tended to, and stories were swapped around Alara's dining tables. The grown-up boys, now heroes, didn't linger long. They were drifters, men of the road, but before they left, each one sought out Alara. They offered thanks, not just for the food and shelter, but for the hope she had given them when they were small and scared. Thomas, before he rode off, simply nodded, a silent promise in his eyes that he would always remember. Life in the town slowly returned to its gentle rhythm, but it was changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep sense of pride and unity. And at the heart of it all remained the Heron's Rest. Alara continued her work, stirring her stew, making her beds, her quiet kindness unwavering. The inn wasn't just a place to sleep anymore. It was a symbol. It stood as a reminder that even the smallest acts of goodness could grow into something powerful enough to protect a whole community. It was a beacon of hope, a place where all were welcome, and where the echoes of loyalty and repaid kindness would forever warm the air.